Hello, my name is Stephen Nash. I'm a historian at East Tennessee State University. I am also the president of the Mountain History and Culture Group, a support board for the Governor Zebulon B. Vance Birthplace State Historic Site in Weaverville, North Carolina. It is in that capacity that today I am going to bring to you an episode in our web series, Quarantined Historians Maybe or Maybe Not Drinking Coffee. And our guest is historian Scott Huffard. Scott Hufford is a historian at Lees McRae College in Banner Elk, North Carolina. He is a native of Pennsylvania. He holds an undergraduate degree from the Pennsylvania State University and graduate degrees from the University of Florida. So like me, Scott is a Pennsylvania native who has received his graduate training in the South. Now a historian at Lees McRae College, Scott is the author of the book Engines of Redemption: Railroads and the Reconstruction of Capitalism in the New South. The book is available from the University of North Carolina Press, as well as local book retailers and online outlets. It's a distinct pleasure to talk about this book with Scott. As many of you probably know, the creation of the Southern Railroad system is an important part of the post-Civil War development of the U.S. South. Historians have written extensively about the history of late 19th century Southern railroads, industrial development, capitalism. All of these themes and issues, including race, convict labor, all come together in interesting ways in Scott's book, Engines of Redemption. So it is a great privilege for me to present to you as a spring speaker for the Mountain History and Culture Group, Scott Hufford, author of Engines of Redemption. So hello, we're joined today by Professor Scott Hufford from Lees McRae College. Scott Hufford is the author of the book Engines of Redemption: Railroads and the Reconstruction of Capitalism in the New South. It's some good product placement. So Scott, thank you for joining me today to talk about your book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you and talk about railroads.
Yeah, let's talk about railroads, because this is such a big part of the story of late 19th century America and late 19th century Southern history. Is you put a significant amount of emphasis on the New Orleans Exposition of 1884 and 1885. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that was, what the exposition was, but then also why you think it was so significant and why you start your book there.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question, and to provide a bit of context, it sort of falls in the category of what we call the World's Fairs, and World's Fairs are, first of all, really fun to study and research. They're these really dramatic events. There's lots of fun exhibits. The narratives of people going through them are really interesting, and as a writer, I liked the idea of kind of walking the reader through the fair as best I could. It was kind of a fun little set piece to write. And there are more than just great stories come out of these events, though. Many cultural historians, particularly those interested in capitalism, have used these as windows that really show what the values of an era are. The organizers that put these events on, they're trying to show what they see as progress. They're trying to tell a certain story and make the story really clear to observers. These are almost sort of training grounds for capitalism. Folks have argued that you go to these events and you learn what the values there, to learn about progress and all these great things. There's lots of other examples of these too. The most prominent, the most famous is the first one in Crystal Palace in England, which pioneers this whole idea of World's Fairs. The Columbian Exposition in Chicago is another big one, in the 1890s, and it's a set piece you see in many books about the Gilded Age. People go to the one in Chicago. So New Orleans has one, and I argue the fact that the South's even having one of these fairs is significant. That's important. The South is saying, hey, we're part of this story too, this story of global capitalist progress, and we see this a lot in the sources from the fair, that people are saying, oh, we're definitely recovered from the war. We're New South now, and this fair is proving this. So it's having the South belong, and that's one kind of one of my pretty big significance here. And they're also talking a lot about cotton too, which I argue is really more symbolic of the earlier era of capitalism before the Civil War. And for the purpose of my book, which is about the railroad, it's a great event too, because all throughout the event, you're seeing the railroad. The railroads are moving people to this event. They're moving the goods. They're moving the exhibits. The pamphlets always are talking about all the new connections coming into New Orleans and how this is a proof of New Orleans being on the map. All these different railroad companies and the companies themselves are setting up exhibits as well. So it's really kind of demonstrating that the railroads created this new era for the South. I also write about this idea of the phantasmagoria, that the sort of dream world is opened up when you read these. It's people giving you these fantastical descriptions of the railroad and what it can do, that the magic of the railroad comes out of this as well. And, it's kind of ironic. The event itself actually was pretty far from what the pamphlets were saying. It was a financial failure. It didn't, of course, match the heights of the Crystal Palace, but it's a microcosm, this idyllic version of this event, at least, of what's happening to the South at large. We're seeing the railroad connect the South. We're seeing circulation of people and commodities, the creation of commodities. All these things are on display and are the values that this exhibition's putting out. So it was a fun set piece to write, but it's also, I think, a part of the book that sort of unlocks the bigger argument that I'm getting at here of how the railroad brings this magic to the region.
Conversations, but you sort of argue for a greater continuity between Old South and New South in terms of capitalism. I was wondering how capitalism linked those two periods. How does capitalism link the Old South and the New South in history?
There's a tendency often to see a dramatic break between the Old South and the New South. This is implied in the names, first of all. Old is slavery, antebellum, and pre-industrial, maybe new is exciting. It's an industry and capitalism. And the names are, of course, myths that were sort of largely created by the boosters. The idea of the Old South comes out of folks in the New South trying to make sure there was this dramatic break between this region. And there's all these stereotypes that persist even in lots of the scholarship. For many decades, historians would write about the Old South, and the general consensus for many is that it's a pre-capitalist society, that what we're seeing in the Old South, plantation slavery, that's not capitalism. That's something entirely different. It might be pre-capitalist or might be feudalist. And we're in an era now where there's lots of good new works that have really been reinterpreting the Old South. We can think about scholars like Edward Baptist or Sven Becker. There's even a name they call it the New History of Capitalism. These works that are really painting the Old South as a very capitalist era. It's tied into global networks of finance. The plantation owner himself has a capitalistic mindset, they're arguing. So my book, in a sense, is trying to kind of pick up and answer some of the questions that these books pose. If we are to see the Old South as intensely capitalist, then what about the New South? How does that change how we interpret what's going on after the Civil War? Do these values and ideas survive? Do they go away? I mean, the title is Reconstruction of Capitalism, and it's sort of in the title of the book, because that's sure tells you what I think is going on. And we talk about reconstruction of all kinds of reconstructions after the Civil War, of buildings, of the economy, of the political system. But I'm talking here more about this ideological reconstruction of capitalism, of how we get the South back to capitalism after the disruptions of the war and the emancipation, which are going to basically make it hard to do what they did for the war, obviously. So there's a lot of questions that have to be answered for both Southerners and Northerners after the Civil War. And, what I kept finding in the sources is that the railroad answers these questions. The railroad is a symbol, it's a powerful symbol. It's a symbol of progress. It's a symbol of the New South. The railroad also is the economic engine that's transforming the economy. There's new railroads everywhere. And there's a a physical reality of the railroad network just doubling in size in 1 decade in the region. So the railroads, answering this economic question and this ideological question at kind of the same time. So that's sort of what the book is whole built around, these moments where we see the magic of the railroad and the moments when we see the magic of the railroad be challenged, and to the darker side of this. So to go back to capitalism, we're seeing capitalism again in the New South era, but it's just taking on different forms. We have big corporations backed by Northern capital coming into the region. Slavery is gone, but we have convict labor instead, which is a new form of labor exploitation used to build the railroads. And the railroad lets us get at all these transformations, I think, which is why it's a great way to organize the project and to take us from old to new.
And clearly, one of the points that you brought up in your response to my question that really kind of helps to connect the old and the New South is sort of systems of labor and slavery, and then you mentioned convict labor. And you describe the New South's convict labor system in the book as, I believe, is capitalism taken to its extreme. Can you tell me more about what you mean by that, and sort of how we can understand convict labor in the postbellum period as capitalism taken to its extreme?
Yeah, that's exactly one of these sort of ways that we see capitalism sort of reinvent itself in the region. And the convict labor system, what was basically going on was all these southern states had lots of prisons, lots of penitentiaries that were filling with mostly African-American prisoners because of all the black codes and these really harsh post-Civil War rules that were, more a method of racial control than anything else. So, the penitentiaries start leasing all these workers for really, really cheap. It's sort of staggering how low the cost is. Leasing these prisoners to industrial concerns, to coal mines, to railroads, of course. And, a lot of the infrastructure of the South is then built by these folks. The coal mine, the railroads are built. And the classic quote that many historians this will say is that it's in a sense even worse than slavery, in a sense. Not trying to imply, of course, that slavery is good in any way, but under convict leasing, the employers, that the companies have little no incentive to keep these people healthy or even really alive. And one dies, get another is the common phrase that we see here. So it's almost total commodification of someone's lives, and that's why I think you can call this capitalism to the extreme. It's using someone solely as commodity to build things, and of course the states are kind of making money off this too. Everyone's making money except for, of course, the workers here. One example that I do write briefly about in the book is one not too far from us in West North Carolina. They build the West North Carolina Railroad after the Civil War, which connects central part of North Carolina to Asheville. And those are pretty serious mountains, and you aren't going to be able to get normal wage laborers to do this, and do this cheaply too, because the state didn't really want to fund this. This was Zebulon Vance's dream to link Asheville to the rest of the state. And to get this done, they had to use convict labor, and the toll is horrific. 125, at least, we think, die from tunnel cave-ins, other causes, mistreatment. And you can see this story on many of the South's railroads. Clinchman, Ohio, there's another one that goes south from Johnson City. That one also has a horrific toll.
My hat off to anybody who feels like they can ever get to the true heart of what was going on with the Western North Carolina Railroad, because there is so much corruption and stock fraud and other sorts of things, and so many different investigations into who was doing what. And I don't know that we'll ever fully understand exactly what was happening with the Western North Carolina Railroad. But how does convict labor fit in terms of the sort of how we understand capitalism, in terms of like a definition of capitalism?
Yeah, well, it's a complicated question too, because how do you define capitalism? That's a question that's bedeviling even the great scholars that we were talking about, the new history of capitalism, because there's all kinds of ways people want to define it. They want to put new names on it. I think, I always think it's important to highlight the darker sides of capitalism, which for, much of the late 20th century, the United States didn't really want to talk about. I think a lot of definitions that a lot of scholars work with were generated during the Cold War, when we tried our best to paint capitalism in a really good light and to be as positive about it as possible, because we're against the communists, so we have to defend ourselves. And I think then the Cold War has opened up new space to acknowledge this darker side of the story, and that's why I think we can see people linking slavery into capitalism, and why I think convict labor also fits in this story as well. I think there might be some who might quibble with this and say, well, you have to have wage laborers. That's when we get capitalism, and this is when we think about transition of feudal England to capitalist society, that's what we get. We get people going from the farms into the factories and getting working at their own pace in the fields to getting wage labor. And convict labor doesn't really square with that, obviously. But I think if we're gonna see slavery as part of capitalism, and that's what a lot of these scholars have been doing, I think convict labor has to fit as well. And then you mentioned the corruption and what's going on at the top of these companies. These are big corporations that are financed by people in the North, people in Europe. There's a lot of stocks and bonds are being used to construct these companies. Railroad companies too are, as business historians argue, the first big business that we see. They're pioneering forms of management. And at the bottom of this, we get the convict laborers who are, of course, making all of this possible. So that's why I think it's worthwhile to fit them in to capitalism.
What you're sort of speaking to is the sort of old, sort of almost Eugene Genovese sort of group argument that, well, slavery couldn't have been capitalist because the incentive for the worker wasn't there. It was the exploitation of the worker. And so, but that doesn't, as Baptist and others, like, that doesn't have to be in place, right? The incentive can simply be survival or to avoid torture, or however you might want to define it in the instance of slavery. Just as a sort of a brief aside, you can sort of say something from the book about the extent to which the South and Southern railroads sort of manufactured, and I sort of mean that they manufactured sort of scapegoats or stories to excuse why Southern railroads were more deadly for passengers.
Train wrecks have a pretty long history in the South. When we think about the train wreck ballad, these songs like the Wreck of the Old 97, most of these are taking place in the South, and it's not just because the balladeers are from here. The South has the highest rate of railroad disasters in the country by the 1890s. We get this really reckless pace of building, through dangerous terrain sometimes, like in West North Carolina. These are companies too that aren't always really well financed. And a company that doesn't have a great financial situation is not going to keep up the maintenance. So a lot of sort of sketchy companies are operating too, and these things make dangerous conditions. And in the chapter I talk about how there's actually some pretty big risk here for the railroads if people start to realize that there's these horrible wrecks happening left and right. That could spiral into pretty big critiques of these companies. The groups like the Populists. There are plenty of people who are ready to launch attacks on the railroads. So what I argued that the railroads were doing is they were trying to pin a lot of these train wrecks on train wreckers. And I found a couple examples that really kind of smoking gun sort of cases here. One of them is in outside Statesville, North Carolina. There was a wreck where it's pretty clear that the railroad lawyers are basically inventing this idea that folks were wrecking these trains to rob them. And for us, it almost seems kind of fantastical that people would do this. People like Jesse James sort of stuff like this, but people causing huge passenger trains to derail just to take their stuff. I mean, that sort of beyond the scope of imagination for us. But the railroads were pushing this narrative, and it was a very racialized one too, because most of the time they're blaming African Americans. And It's the 1890s in the South, and as someone who knows about this period quite a bit, this is also when we're seeing, the same type of panic about Black criminality in all kinds of forms. That there's, allegedly rapes happening everywhere, and this is leading to a spike in lynching. So, this corporate fueled panic kind of fits alongside that, and it's a way for the companies to kind of distract from sort of horrible carnage that's going on. And again, it was a very grim chapter, right? Doing lots of train wrecks, but digging into the sources, there's quite a few examples of even the president saying, "Well, yeah, let's just make sure that we say it's the train wreckers," and they're quite open in their correspondence about this, and it's sort of shocking. And again, maybe another good example of the dark side of the railroads in this time period.
I had to figure out a way to sort of distract the public conversation away from the safety of the railroads. And as you said, a lot of these railroads were built sort of hastily. They used inferior sort of materials, and that led to unsafe conditions and increased wrecks. But that would be bad for business. So you had to figure out a way to explain it, and tapping into the sort of racial tensions and ideologies that were at play in the 1890s was a way for these companies to very much sidestep their own sort of shortcomings, their own failures. And you have some really great material in here that one of the sort of unintended consequences of the railroad system was the spreading of diseases, highly infectious diseases. How did railroads in the South spark epidemics, and how did Southern communities deal with them?
Yeah, this is the chapter that's getting a lot of attention. Every interview, it's one everyone kind of zooms right towards because for obvious reasons. It's one that's super, super topical. It's ironically the first chapter that I wrote. It's sort of where the project came out of these epidemics. But essentially what I was looking at is how yellow fever spreads over the railroads. And yellow fever is something that was a big problem for port cities in the South. Places like New Orleans, Pensacola, Savannah. It would have been sort of a fact of life in places like that. But after the Civil War, we start getting these revived railroads and new routes and new connections and improved circulation. The corridor that is a real big problem for this is the Illinois Central, which goes from New Orleans to Chicago. And now we have a railroad running lots of trains out of the city, which is sort of the worst for yellow fever for much of the 19th century. And a really big outbreak hits in 1878, which is very interesting timing too. This is as military reconstruction is kind of winding down. It's a really interesting kind of moment when this happens. And there's been a lot of good historians who've written about a lot of aspects of this, and the timing of everything. But I looked at this and looked at how railroad towns were getting hit really hard. All these towns like Grenada, Mississippi, Holly Springs, these are towns just along this railroad corridor where we're getting devastated. And they had not seen yellow fever before these places. It's the far interior Mississippi, and they thought they were pretty much immune. And, the vector is probably either people going into the trains or even mosquitoes themselves hitching a ride in the trains. But it's pretty clear that the railroads are helping to lead to these outbreaks. And, the response to this is this huge, 20,000 people die in the South. They can say a huge outbreak, huge problem. And, every summer after this, there's sort of panicky responses every time yellow fever pops its head up. And the main kind of focus of the chapter, I talk about the shotgun quarantine, which is when people in a town along a railroad would just basically get their guns out and stop the trains on their own, and either stop the trains or make sure no one gets off. They would say, "Hey, just keep moving. Don't stop here." And it's an interesting moment because this is clearly showing that they aren't trusting the railroads to keep them safe because there's threats of violence against the companies. In one outbreak, people even blowing up bridges outside Jackson, Mississippi because they're so sort of terrified about this. It's also showing that the regulation is not working either. There are state boards of health. The federal government starts to try to get involved, but this is not stopping these shotgun quarantines. People just fundamentally aren't trusting the railroads, which again kind of dovetails with the train wrecks, things like that. That the companies were not very popular, and folks don't have faith in them to keep them healthy, essentially. And these shotgun quarantines really don't end until 1905. they find the mosquito vector in the Spanish American War. They realize that's what transmits yellow fever. And they realize mosquito control is how you stop this. And after that, we finally see things calm down. But it was a huge and I think kind of overlooked problem for the railroad companies that every summer they're dealing with this. It's tying up traffic, especially when we start to get outbreaks in Florida too.
Did the railroads do anything to sort of combat the image of being unhealthy? Did they start throwing money around or anything to try to convince people that they were wrong, or anything along those lines?
Yeah, they did. I mean, and you know, my chapter focuses mainly on the negative aspects of this and the quarantines, but the railroads were trying to help some of these communities. I mean, these are towns that rely on the railroad now. You're along the railroad, that's where your stuff comes from, your food comes from, and
Right.
and some of these towns are actually at risk of running out of supplies. This happens actually in Florida because the way Florida is, it's a peninsula, there's choke points, and people start blocking the railroad, then people in South Florida are not going to get their stuff. And the railroads, they do actually step up because nurses and doctors are taking the trains into these communities. There's aid. The North, especially, there's a lot of sympathy. This is as Reconstruction's ending. Edward Bloom has argued in his book, this is a good example of reconciliation after the war. The North is feeling pretty bad for the South, and all this money's flowing in, and the railroads were trying to sort of help with that. Though at the same time, they're also trying to sue towns that were stopping traffic. They're also making all these threats to locals that are trying to stop things. So again, there's these sort of two responses, but I mean, the railroads were still providing essential medical care, food supplies. They also were allowing folks to leave too. The trains out of Florida, the railroad companies are trying to work with the government on those to get those people out who wanted to leave Florida. So it's not all, blame the railroads. They were trying their best to help out, and but it is still a bit of a PR disaster too, for sure.
Right. As we talked about with convict labor and a lot of the folks who are impacted by the railroads, getting to their voices, to their stories can be really challenging and really difficult. And you employ a variety of sources in this book. You use the obvious sort of company records and political records and whatnot, but you also make really wide use of railroad songs and ballads and things. I wonder if you could sort of speak a bit more about others. I know you already sort of alluded, but highlight a few, explain how they fit your book, and just the research that you did into these songs.
Yeah, no, the songs are a huge part of it. I've always loved train songs. Think it's interesting, because the train songs give you sort of this ambiguity that the book's all about. Train songs often give you the darker side of the story, or they tell you about your lover going away. A lot of the blues songs that have those in the book a little bit. They focus on the romantic destruction that the railroad can cause. So, a book that's trying to give us this ambiguous relationship with the railroad in the South. The songs are a way to get at that, I think, and that's why they sort of are infused throughout the book. It's a sort of coincidence, not coincidence. I mean, it's revealing actually that so many train songs are set in the South. People are going on southbound trains. They're going to Georgia on trains, and that again, I think speaks to this interesting relationship the region has to the railroad. In a more kind of nuts and bolts research, kind of approach here, the songs, as you said, do help us recover workers' experiences. If we're trying to write about the life of a convict laborer, I mean, you're only really getting corporate records. Maybe they might have these guys as just numbers, and there's not much about the lived experience. One song, to local Western Carolina, Swan to a Tunnel, which is about this tunnel cave-in, near Black Mountain, on the way to Asheville, basically. And that's a song that gives us this awful tragedy and tells us something about how the workers were working. And these songs also then spread through the railroad network too, as people go from work camp to work camp. And it's a sort of, it's voices from below that I think complement the sort of top down sources I'm also giving at, the newspapers and the corporate archives and things like that. Another kind of big song, Railroad song I deal with is the song Railroad Bill, because another one of these songs, kind of like John Henry, that is kind of entered into the folk canon. And I try to drill down into the real history of Railroad Bill, which is slightly different than the song, because you do have to always be careful with songs, because people add in new verses, they go in different interesting directions. But it was a part of the book that was kind of fun to write, because that it adds a lyricality, I think, to the writing. I think it makes the book more interesting, I think, and the songs, I think, do reveal quite a lot. As I was saying, with the fact that there's all these train wreck ballads set in the South, that's something there, something interesting. So it's a thread I tried to work throughout the book, and you listen to songs as you read the book if you want, maybe, and you can enjoy it in a whole new way, maybe. But it was definitely one of the more fun aspects of the project too, being able to write about all these songs.
Don't necessarily know, and sort of you referenced one of the songs just now about Railroad Bill. Who is Railroad Bill? Like, what can you sort of tell us about him, and sort of, because he's another fairly significant part in a chapter in the book.
Yeah, well, Railroad Bill, and some of you may know the song. It's one that's been covered by many people. But if you don't know the song or the story, he was an African American train robber from Alabama, and that in itself is kind of interesting. It's the 1890s when Jim Crow is consolidating across the South, and here we have this African American guy who is robbing trains, and he got quite good at it. He would hop aboard the trains, chuck stuff out the back, or find ways to do it. I mean, he had all these sort of good tactics for how to rob the trains. So good in fact that they started thinking he was magical. People would in the newspaper say, "Oh, Railroad Bill, he can shapeshift into a fox." And you get interviews with railroad employees who say, "Oh, I know he's impervious to bullets. He's got superhuman powers," which I tried to kind of break that down a little bit. And I think it's mainly because he's just so skilled at this. He knows what he's doing. He's taking advantage of systemization. He's taking advantage of the fact that trains are going at regular times. He kind of knows what he's doing. And he has the support and help of the African American community in the area where he's operating, which is, far west Florida and South Alabama, basically. So he's an interesting figure to kind of build a chapter. And I also write about a white train robber too, who has similar kind of story, and I look at how his story's been sort of twisted in a sense by the song. The true story is kind of horrific, because it leads to this big backlash. Lots of African Americans were killed for looking like him, or people thought they were Railroad Bill. There's this sort of panicky reaction, as you'd expect from white Alabamans. But in song, he becomes this sort of great folk hero, and you can again see why. He's someone who was sort of challenging the status quo. He's challenging the railroads. Again, railroads aren't particularly popular by this point for some of the reasons I've talked about. So a guy who's robbing them or challenging them is going to be someone who's going to gain some popularity, obviously. So the song gives us a hint as just the mythologizing of this guy, and it was again another one of these sort of fun chapters to write about, and I was find the actual newspaper coverage of his robberies and sort of contrast them with the song and look at the reality versus the myth that comes out of this.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's interesting, and I'm sort of recalling the chapter, right, that to a lot of African Americans, Railroad Bill kind of becomes like a Robin Hood type figure that, that they sort of cheer him on, and he has sort of community support in that regard. But then, as you're talking about, the sort of panicky white and railroad response could lead to, deaths of, dozens of people just for the suspicion that they could be Railroad Bill. So there's some real sort of complex history at play in that sort of the memory and the culture, and also the reality. I appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk with me about your book and your research. And again, I think it's a really great book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The writing is, I mean, it's a fun book to read. And if you have an interest in railroads and Southern history, there's a lot to think about here, dealing with race and capitalism and just the nature of the South through the 19th century. So I think it's a really thought-provoking book. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about
Yeah,
it.
well, thanks for asking some great questions and for enjoying the book too. Hope you out there pick it up and enjoy it as well. It was fun to write, and hopefully it's fun to read as well.